Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming today. I was excited to get to talk on a topic that's real important to me. My name's Lindsay. I have a private practice called Proteograce Psychology that I kicked off a little over a year ago. So that's been super exciting. Prior to being in private practice, I've worked a little bit in university counseling centers as well as within the juvenile justice system. So I'll actually share a little bit about how that ties into my interest in this area today. And I work mostly around trauma. I am EMDR trained. I really love working with folks on their relationships. I think that's something that just really excites me. I really love working with college students. And I think in general, I've just found that more often than not, underneath a lot of our stuff that we come in with is the relationship to it. So a lot of being hard on self or on our experiences or just having a lot of judgment or reactions to what we're experiencing often is so much of the work. And so that's kind of a little bit of, wow, how I got to today of wanting to talk about self-compassion. So I'm going to start with a little exercise if you guys are comfortable. I'm not necessarily going to ask you guys to share, but I just kind of want to get us into that space. And this is something I sometimes also do with clients a little bit earlier on in the process, just to kind of start a conversation. This is not necessarily deeper healing work per se, but for some folks it can be because it can be new and kind of eye-opening in that way. But I want you just for now, just to kind of, if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes, just kind of settle into your body a little bit. And we'll just spend a minute or two here, nothing too long. But I just want you to think of a time recently where maybe you were just a little hard on yourself. Maybe you made a mistake, didn't get something turned in on time, forgot something that somebody asked you about. Maybe said something, it didn't come out the way that you meant. But just take a moment to think of a recent time where you're hard on yourself. And as you do this, I just want you to take like a little inventory. Just check in on what's going on inside as you notice that. Maybe kind of bringing a little awareness to how you responded to yourself, noticing any sensations in your body. Just spend a moment or two there. Now I want you to just, for a moment, call to mind someone in your life who you really care about. Ideally, this is someone that's just really easy for you to show up for, maybe a close friend, a partner, somebody you really empathize with. Um, and I just want you to imagine maybe something in their life they've shared with you, or maybe they've gone through something similar to what you just called to mind about yourself. Um, but I just want you to pick something that they're going through that's kind of difficult. I'll give you a moment to do that, just kind of to imagine that. As you imagine them going through that tough time, I just want you to bring some awareness to how you might respond to them. Maybe that's just noticing your heart for them. Maybe it's things you'd actually say. Maybe just some sensations in your body. When you're ready, you can just kind of return to the meeting for a moment. We'll kind of press pause here just briefly. If we were working one-on-one, this might be an opportunity where I might want to check in because occasionally, even though this is geared towards helping you have kind feelings towards a friend, that doesn't always happen. I have learned. So I like just to check in, but I'm going to go for today's purposes. I'm going to go off the assumption that you were having loving, kind, tender feelings towards this person, maybe felt some warmth in your heart and in your body. And so briefly now, I just want you to kind of go back to that moment with your friend and imagine them again. And now I just want you to take a moment to pretend that you are um, criticizing them, maybe lashing out a little, saying something not so kind, maybe kind of having a little bit of judgment. I just want you to just kind of notice what that feels like. Any tension in your body, any changes in the sensations. Okay. And you guys can come on back. Obviously, this is like a little brief kind of way to go about this, but if you guys are like most folks that I work with, myself included around this, that idea is very uncomfortable. Like we really like don't love the idea of imagining someone we care about and love and kind of ripping them to shreds or saying something mean or being really like harsh towards them. Like that just feels icky inside. And I like this exercise because what it can kind of begin to start a conversation around is not only, how we feel towards a friend, but also kind of the difference in the sensations that we get from where you started and to where you finished there. Because you started by noticing a little bit about like when you're harsh towards yourself. But usually the feelings when you're harsh towards a friend tend to be reported back to me as much stronger, much more uncomfortable, much more unpleasant, things like that. And so we're starting to just begin to kind of notice that there's a little bit of that discrepancy there. And so that's some kind of a way I like to enter into that work and to kind of notice that. And to begin to just recognize like how easy it is to say really awful things towards ourselves. So we can really easily be like, oh, I'm such an idiot, or I'm so stupid, or I'm such a failure, whatever it might be. Whereas we would really shudder at the idea of sharing that with someone else. And so sometimes that's a nice entry point into this conversation. I think it sounds like Ellie, you've maybe done a little bit of that work too. And it's just a really great experiential way of saying, well, there's a difference in that sensation. So we can start to be a little curious about. So a little bit before we jump on into just the talk for today, I was going to share a little bit about just kind of how I got here, or a little bit more about my background, just to kind of guide today's conversation a little bit. But I really feel like this has been woven throughout my story, both like in and outside of the therapy room. So I was a college athlete. I was very achievement oriented. I would very much pride myself on being a hard worker. But a lot of times, I notice now looking back, I would really kind of push myself past my limits, or I wouldn't just be as aware of like, hey, my body's trying to tell me this is too much. Because I was like, hey, get better, get stronger, be a good leader, all these different things. And what was ironic about it is with my teammates. I would be like, why are you so hard on yourself? Like, be kind, like you're so judgy or like whatever. Like, I would just like be so noticing of that in them. But there was a little bit of a discrepancy of what I would see in myself. And I think part of that a little bit was that what I was doing and how I was acting, I think in a lot of ways was also really applauded. It was praised, it was seen as like hard worker, good leader, all these different things, but led to just a lot of internal things for me, and as well as like probably preventable injuries and stuff like that looking back. And so what I found is that more and more of us can probably relate to that idea of it's kind of easier sometimes to kind of see that when we're looking at somebody across from us than it is maybe within our own story to notice. And then I started thinking about my clinical work. I didn't really call the self-compassion throughout my whole like time I've been seeing clients. But when I look back and I think about the issues that I focus the most on, there is kind of an interesting kind of thread woven through it all that I feel like is self-compassion in a lot of ways. So as I started out in the juvenile justice system working with kids on detention centers, we were looking at a lot of things like internalized stigma or racism, as well as like really disenfranchised experiences of loss, things like having a parent incarcerated, or while being incarcerated, you didn't get to experience the birth of a sibling, or maybe it's just like in general, not feeling like there was space for their feelings of like what it was like for a probation officer to like take them out of a classroom in front of like all of their peers and like, oh, you can't feel bad about that, or like whatever it might be. So there's a lot of work around trying to create more space for what was really there. And then in like college students, a lot of like perfectionism, like really wanting to achieve, especially while I was on my internship at Georgia Tech. It's like working with a ton of international students who are trying to get into graduate programs, and it was like high stakes or these really important internships, and like the criteria were really, really intense. And there was just such a high inner critic, such like an over-functioning mentality, and they were dwindling. I mean, like really, really struggling, really, really high rates of stress and anxiety, really low self-care. Like you could just kind of see that. And so those would be a lot of the things I focus on, as well as like relationships and all the fun things that come with college too. And then in private practice, I noticed like the more trauma work I'm doing, the more shame is popping up. Just this layer around the story that the story itself isn't okay. It's not okay that I have had these experiences, and that can look and sound a number of different ways for folks. So like while all these things were really different, it felt like the work was kind of all leading to that similar place of how do we relate to what we're experiencing? How do we respond to what's there? How do we react to it? And there's often these like really deeply held beliefs and feelings about our own experiences or just our experiences in the world, which can lead to, I found in my mandated clients, a little more resistance is what it was kind of called. But I think it was a lot of just like not feeling the permission to feel a lot of things a lot of the times. And then in general, like with a lot of my clients feeling really just like stuck in their pain and they're not sure because they're like just trying so hard to like over function out of their pain, but it makes them feel more and more stuck. Um, so that's kind of where I enter in as to like why I care about this, like why it's important, why I've found it to be really valuable in the work that I do, even though I haven't always called it traditionally maybe self-compassion work until more recently, like kind of seeing, okay, that sounds like what a lot of it is. So the way I think of self-compassion, and truly feel free to jump in at any point. I know I'm just kind of rambling. At first I was like, what am I going to talk about? And then as I started writing stuff down, I was like, oh, I have a lot that I could talk about. So feel free to interrupt me, please. Um, but the way that I think about self-compassion is just how it's like a posture in a lot of ways. So it's like how do we like hold ourselves towards ourselves? And so kind of borrowing from a lot of the work out there, but for me, it's non-judgment, it's observant, and eventually it's tender and kind. But for a lot of folks, that tender and kindness to me is like the end goal. I don't find that most people have a lot of buy-in if we jump there too soon. And so if I'm working with someone and trying to have a more compassionate approach in the work or in their experiences, I think if I move too quickly to softness and tenderness and kindness, people feel it's very fake. It's not honoring what's really there. There's a lot of like, whoa. And so I'm going to talk a little more about some maybe pitfalls of the work around entering some stuff too quickly because I think that can be very natural sometimes, but it can kind of go against getting to the deeper places and can be very resisted against, which I imagine you've maybe been there a time or two with clients as well. But for me, I think if we can help clients start with curiosity, that's a win because that seems even difficult to help clients move there sometimes from this really works for me. This is what I need to do to a place of can I just get curious about it without necessarily having to change it or shift it in any way, but just trying to get to know this a little bit more. Um, so what I've come to believe about self-compassion is that it opens space for deeper healing. It kind of helps us break down some of those things that can kind of be a barrier to getting to those deeper places. It can increase connection and authenticity in our relationships. We can just show up a little bit more fully ourselves instead of having to, what I'll call in this talk today, like engage in wonky ways to get what we need. And it can also help folks start to shift towards like what they actually care about instead of having a more reactionary kind of way of living. So those are kind of be the areas I hope to dive a little bit into more today. And as I'm doing that, I'm mindful of like kind of trying to sprinkle in some interventions because it seems like the practical side is where I think many of us kind of goes like, what does this really look like? How do we do this? So Dr. Neff, Dr. Kristen Neff, you guys might be familiar with her. She's kind of big name in this field. Her resources on selfcompassion.org have been highly valuable for my clients. I will say it's been a moment since I've personally like dived into them, but I remember I used to use them a lot and I was really enjoying them and my clients were really enjoying them. My one uh caveat or warning or heads up, I don't know, is that for some folks, they find her to be so welcoming and inviting and therapeutic in her tone. And for other people, they're like, I cannot do it because it's like overly therapeutic sounding. And so because I got that feedback from a lot of people for whatever reason, I just warn people now. I'm literally like, just the voice may or may not work for you, but just try to listen to what she's saying, apply what she's saying, maybe record it for yourself if that feels helpful, like whatever. So that's my little off the cuff comment there. But her big thing is she talks a lot about self-kindness, mindfulness, and common humanity. So she's really wanting to help us try to realize that suffering, failure, imperfection, all those kinds of things are part of being human, and that we are not alone in that suffering. And that's a common experience that we can connect to others in. That can actually be really connecting as we get more in touch with that. And that through doing more self-compassion work, we actually become more present, more mindful, and we increase our capacity to stay in the moment. Andy Kolber's another author and therapist that I really like. She integrates some self-compassion work with also with the faith perspective. But even if the faith perspective isn't applicable for folks, a lot of her work on self-compassion is really great. And she talks a lot about the window of tolerance and how we have to be able to help clients stay in that place to really be able to integrate and do this work, because otherwise it's going to be really, really difficult. So I think that kind of really goes hand in hand with Dr. Neff talking about mindfulness. And then obviously the research also talks about how this can lead to decreased stress, anxiety, depression, things like that. So it's really compelling to consider how can we help clients be kinder towards themselves. So for me, the how in a lot of ways is storytelling and curiosity. I think those are, if you leave today, like, okay, what are some takeaways? I would say helping clients tell their story and helping clients become more curious about their experiences are like foundational to the work. And storytelling can look different. That could look like doing more of an experiential processing through EMDR, or that can look more like a narrative approach. I think that's where this work can really be integrated into most of the major approaches. I think IFS and self-compassion work go very hand in hand. I've dipped my baby toe into IFS, so I can't speak a ton on it today. But from what I've heard, I'm like so drawn to it. I'm like, this is incredible. This just lines up and gives me language for what I've been trying to do and convey when I'm communicating with clients about this stuff. So if you're interested in this area, I think IFS could also potentially be a really nice framework. Um, but I think for so many folks, the reason the storytelling component is so important is because this isn't typically new. I feel like most of my clients, like when they're coming in with this stuff, like it's been there. Like if I start to really like ask them or explore with them, like what's been kind of going on, like this is not like they're like, oh, this goes back, like this is as far as I can remember back. Like I can't even actually name an event or a time, like this just goes. And so I think the way that that helps me to enter in with a lot of curiosity is thinking, and like a lot of compassion on my end is thinking too, like at one point, this human that's sitting across from me right now was this snuggly, tooty, giggly, little precious little baby, and didn't have these feelings about themselves, did not speak to themselves in this way, did not relate to their emotions in this way. And throughout their story became, they started to hold these beliefs, they started to begin to relate to themselves in this way. And so how can we kind of start to begin to explore that, unpack that, and better understand kind of what they were needing in those moments that's kind of caused them to react in this way. Because as we all know, as much as it looks on the surface like this isn't helping, at some point it served a purpose and was adaptive for them in dealing with whatever was going on or helping them get a need met in a way that they best could at that time. And so like really kind of entering into that place of they didn't just wake up overnight like I'm not lovable or I'm too much or I'm not good enough or whatever it is. But this is something that's been there and been a part of their story. So again, I think EMDR is great in the sense that we can kind of get down to maybe some of those earlier experiences on a deeper level. But I think that the biggest thing is one of the biggest pitfalls I think in this is trying to get rid of it. And so I think if we enter in with a client, and they come in and they're like, I'm such a piece of trash, like da 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 da. And we're like, no, you're not, right? Don't talk that way. Don't think that. Like, what do you mean? Like, why do you think that? Immediately, what we're doing, unfortunately, even though that's like probably kind in a sense of like we're saying, like, no, that's not true, right? Like, there's a part of us that believes that. We're holding that. We're cutting out an opportunity for that in that moment for the client to have like curiosity and connection with their own experience and to begin to reduce the shame that's there because we're kind of bypassing or trying to get rid of that thing that we're like, no, 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 that's not real. And I think a lot of times that's probably what's going on outside of therapy. And so I think that then like reinforces the shame of like, well, I shouldn't feel this way because everything in my life is great. And whatever it might be. Like, I don't know why, what's wrong with me? Am I broken? Or, all these different things. And so, if it feels like it could be therapeutically beneficial to share that you don't see that, you could probably do that in like a way of, I don't know, something like, um, I'm guessing if I'm noticing I don't see you this way, is that what other people often tell you? Right. And then they can start to tell the story of what that's been like to receive that feedback, and like what it's been like for other people to respond to them in that way. So you can kind of play around that if it feels therapeutic to share your experience in that sense, or to be immediate in that way. But the biggest thing is we want to honor how this has helped them. And I think that that can be a really odd concept for a lot of folks. Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know. Or they're very attached to the idea of how it can help them. And we're trying to help them see, how it's serving them without any compassion. And so it's not that we have to get rid of it, but what would it look like to turn some of that compassion that they have for others and start to shift that inward? And how does that then feel, for them, and starting just to begin to understand the story. Um, so I think at the end of the day, it's like, you know, we want to try to create a space where they can start to have some curious around what is it in me that believes I'm not that good, or I'm not enough, or I'm too much, or whatever it is. We're trying to just start to kind of facilitate that.
What are
Um,
some of like the examples that you've heard, or their common themes that you find of why folks feel really attached to the lack of self-compassion or self-loathing? Like
mhm.
how does it serve them?
Yeah, I think the first one that jumps to my mind, is like productivity culture a little bit, or like, feeling that they really need to have a high standard of excellence or performance. And so if I'm not hard on myself, am I then going to be, um, like lazy, or am I then going to be not as committed to my work, or am I not going to get things done, or whatever it might be? So I think that's a really big one that I notice, especially for people who are particularly hard on themselves in a more like over functioning kind of type of way. Um, I think there's also a relational component that if they're not hard on themselves, then, that's sometimes protecting them from getting hurt, maybe in a relationship. And so, almost like, can I beat them to the chase? So, like, if I can be like real with myself, or like this way with myself, then like other people can't hurt me, or, I can't get like rejected in this relationship because I already know, like, it's kind of like protective in a relational sense. Those are some that kind of come for me, just like right off the cuff. Um, yeah, it's a great question. Does anybody else have any that come to mind for them? I'd love to hear, before we move on.
I feel like, especially clients who maybe come from more of a religious background, there can
Mhm.
be this feeling like it's cocky or
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
there's just not this awareness that there could be a different way of relating inside that's different from self-criticism or always assuming that there's a problem to be fixed or something wrong.
Mhm.
Um, and so maybe that's a little bit of sort of black and white thinking
Mhm.
going on there. But I think the two that you touched on are the ones that I run into the most as well.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I run into those the most, and I was thinking like from an attachment lens too. Sometimes it shows up like I don't deserve that because my parents never loved me. I have a client that both parents abuse in all the forms that you can think of. So it really came down to like she wasn't wanted even at infant level, and she knew that. So I was like, "Ooh, this is deep." So that was kind of hard to navigate, and I think really, and let me know if you've ever experienced that, but it was really being able to build like new secure relationships and be able to like create space for seeing that she was loved today to kind of like, and we did EMDR and did some trickery to address birth and everything, but yeah, healing in relationships I think was the only way that we were able to really go there. But have you seen that working maybe even with juveniles, and how'd you navigate it?
Yeah. I'm trying to think like, if specific examples come to mind. I think the I think the piece that you said about like never having had some like really fundamental experiences, that one felt relatable in a lot of ways. I think when I was working in the Department of Juvenile Justice, I think so majority of my caseload, I would say 75% of my caseload was Black. And the remaining people on my caseload was probably majority were Latinx, and I maybe like one or two clients that were white throughout that time. And I think that really reflects the nature of that system in general. Um, and so I think as we were like talking about these things, it was not only what they experienced at home that they didn't have, it was also like then how that then kind of trickled out into like if you think of like your innermost people, the next layer, the next layer. And so it was at these different levels. And so I think that's really challenging because it does hit on a part of you that, or at least for me personally, where I'm like, I kind of want to confront that. Like, I want to be like, well, that's not true, right? Like, I can feel that in me. And I'm looking at this person who's not had experiences otherwise. And so that can be, like you said, I think really like very tricky into it speaks to like a deeper part of them than just like entering into this place of like, no, 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 like that's not true and whatnot. An interesting answer that's coming up for me to your question is I actually found group work to be really helpful in those particular cases in the sense of I think it speaks to a little bit of maybe Dr. Neff's work around common humanity and seeing the shared experience in that sense. And it really was powerful when you would start to see one shift, like if one kid shifted in their narrative in any way or had an experience where they were like a lived experience where they're starting to say like I'm kind of experiencing this different right now in this room or with these people, it almost created like a really cool reaction of like other people then could start to see some of those dynamics. So it's kind of that like corrective emotional experience like in the therapy room in the group. And I found that to be really really powerful in a way. So I don't know, I got a little off tangent there, but um, yeah, it's a great question. Um, any other thoughts while we're here, or we keep rolling?
I have one thing to add. I think like with people pleasing too, a lot of my
Mhm.
clients, they struggle with the idea of like not being considered themselves, right? And always considering others and like over functioning for other people.
Mhm.
So obviously that idea of like thinking about how someone is going to respond and not, being attuned to their own feelings and like what they have going on internally. So what came up for me while you were talking is that the idea that some people have that like self-compassion is like selfish or it
Yeah.
feels selfish to them. But they're
Mhm.
able to like hold space and like maybe, I mean, compassion or maybe some pseudo form of compassion
Mhm.
for others, right? Because
Mhm.
like it's coming from a place of fear, but um, when they're trying to appease. But yeah,
Mhm.
that kind of came up for me that I hear a lot from clients is like
Yeah.
how selfish that feels to be compassionate toward themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that's like immediately where I think of like so much of this of like how do they begin to like look back into their own story where that became true for them, right? Like what was going on and what needs were kind of going unmet in those moments where that was what was kind of expressed or demonstrated in their life, whether it was to them directly or it was more indirectly or what was going on, that they started to kind of feel that, right? And I think too, um, a big part of this is like relationally, how does this stuff show up? Because I think what we're all talking about and kind of getting to is how this can cause folks to relate to in different ways because of what they're feeling. And so I think about similar to attachment, interpersonal like theory looks a little bit like kind of moving towards in a way. And I love that kind of for me, it's just a little simpler. It's just like, okay, like what are the tendencies here with someone when they're in this place? And so how does self-criticism and shame also impact the way they're showing up and engaging with others? And then how does that then impact their current needs, right? And so that's kind of another piece that tends to come up in this work. And so sometimes that can look like from a place of shame or self-criticism, um, overly seeking affirmation from someone, really moving towards, but in a kind of off-putting way, or in a way that can kind of push others away in a sense. And so it can sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way, or sometimes as they're doing that, they then fall back on, well, if I hadn't sought them out that aggressively, they wouldn't have really cared. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy again of whatever it is, like that their needs don't matter, they're not good enough, or whatever. And similarly, moving away can have similar dynamics. And so as they get to know themselves more and open up this space, even just a little bit, by just observing that there is this critical part, that might just be step one, right? And starting to see how that's impacting them emotionally. It could also show up like, how's this showing up in their behavior and kind of the way that they're coping with life. Oftentimes, a lot of people, it's kind of rigid. Like they kind of get stuck in these patterns. And they're like, I don't know why I keep doing this in this way. And it's kind of sometimes intense and things like that. And so they can start to now think of and shift a little bit of how they're engaging. And I think through that, it's almost corrective for a lot of folks with the right combination of factors. I think that the person they're trying these things with needs to be like a safe, good, solid human. And there's learning in both, but I think that's really helpful in the sense of learning how to connect in a more authentic and meaningful way. And then sometimes through that experience, when they bring some of those layers down, they're more directly getting what they need, setting better boundaries. And then they're also realizing they're not alone, because oftentimes by then opening that door, other people can connect to that part of them that they've been keeping pushed away, kind of hidden, or so criticized that people don't feel like they can really speak to it because they're like, that can't touch that because that's like too much for that person, or whatever it might be. So that's where kind of the EMDR comes in with like noticing. And then IFS, I think, comes in with a lot of like these different parts and how they operate and how they're showing up. And then the importance of us as therapists, like allowing our intuition to really guide this, and really relying heavily on the rapport that we build, the compassion we have. At times, I think humor is really important in this work too. Not maybe too often, but every once in a while, kind of reflecting things back with a little bit of a look of like, really, is this what we're saying? I think can be really, really helpful, and can guide us because we can feel those things in the room with us too. So I think that's a really big piece, and we can start to have that corrective experience like with us, I think is really key in this work. And so that's where noticing our own reactions to clients is really valuable, gives us good information as what might be going on outside, maybe what's going on with us. But if we can stay in that place of curiosity and compassion towards our client, that's like, I think, one of the most important pieces in any of this. I think if we lose that, you could do interventions until the cows come home and the client's not going to be able to do that work because they're not going to be able to let themselves go to that place. And they won't necessarily maybe have like kind of that guide in the session. So as we're kind of getting a little closer to time, I'll just run through these last few things real quick. But I think the biggest thing, like I said, is helping clients tell their story, also maybe get to know their story. I think sometimes folks come in, they genuinely don't know what's going on. And if they're really defended about a certain thing, like that they're a way they're operating or how it's going, like some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, I sometimes don't even really address it. I sometimes might enter in with more of, man, like, I'm just really struck by how exhausting that sounds. And I just let it sit. And what I notice is even though that thing is still there, my client's now shifting from, I have to keep this thing to, yeah, I am exhausted. And it just enters into a different conversation and space. And that sounds maybe like a kind of oversimplified thing, but I think relationally that stuff can go far because then the curiosity can naturally come from that. And some of the stuff, they almost forget that they're defending it for a minute because they're tapping into a different part of their experience. And so sometimes that is a nice way. Or it sounds like you've really been struggling like this for a long time, like just whatever it might be, and just like really creating that space for them that they're probably not creating for themselves, or other folks definitely aren't outside maybe the therapy room. And I think from there, once they get to know the story, we can shift into what they need, what they're needing, kind of what it's pointing to, and then offering hope to themselves that there's another way. Like how can we address this differently? What are some other options? And that might look like somebody who's been trying to sprint a marathon their whole life, right? Just go, 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 go. We might just say, okay, can we sprinkle in little breaks here and there? Like some of these things might not be super profound, but we're just trying to teach them and their bodies there's another way. And then through that, trusting that the like experiential learning will take place within their body and within their experiences. And then they can come back and share with us what that looks like. So yeah, I think the big things that they're learning along the way is that they can be more present, that they can be like more real with people. Yeah, that this thing in them that has been causing pain, that they're maybe now seeing it that way, has also been helpful to them. It's not always bad. We're not trying to demonize it. We're just trying to say, hey, the right thing at a wrong time might not be the right thing. And so, are there other things that are better? And I actually really like the kind of act philosophy of the driver. And so if for a long time this part of them's been driving along and been in control of them, their choices of the direction they're going and everything they're doing has been kind of limited. And so I'm not trying to boot this person out of the car unless they want to. That's fine. But more so, can we put this person in the passenger or the back seat where they're still there? They still can mentor you. They can still jump up if we need to swap drivers, but you're ultimately feeling like you have more say so in your life, more agency, more control, less rigidity, all these kinds of things. And I think folks really like that, especially when they start to touch base with the parts of them that are exhausted and need rest or nourishment or, whatever it might be. And so lastly, yeah, I'm getting there, y'all. The biggest thing, again, we've talked about is like, we're not trying to get rid of this thing. We're trying to help clients have a little bit more agency. But as we shift from their, I don't know, I think the biggest thing that is so powerful to see and to try to facilitate with folks is as they're shifting from this belief, this thing that's like deep in them, this felt sense about who they are, however you want to phrase that, depending on how you kind of think about things clinically, is like they can shift from reacting to that to being more proactive in their life. And I think that feeling, clients are wanting that so bad because they're feeling so stuck and so driven by this thing like over and over. And I think you can kind of start doing a little values-based work in there before even a client gets to that place by let's just start increasing some things that really matter to you in your life anyways, right? Because that's also going to create positive experiences, give a little better sense of self. They're leaning into what matters. But I think as people shift away from feeling so driven by what's wrong with them, protecting against fears or whatever it might be, they start to lean into like, oh, I can actually like move towards what I like and what feels good versus trying to move away from this thing that's really uncomfortable or upsetting or whatever it might be for me. And you guys were asking about like, how do we like get that started? Like for someone who's really stuck or maybe this is like really difficult for them. I've actually started out like with when it's just like the get-go, I just ask people to pay attention for like 2 days or 3 days, or they can pick whatever, just something manageable between sessions. And they keep a note in their phone or a tally somewhere on a journal, sticky note, whatever. And every time they notice just a kind of critical thought-ish, they just keep track. And I just want them to see how often or how regularly this is happening. And we might start entering into this idea with what does it look like to shift from 12 times a day? Can we make that 10? Can we, on two of those different occasions, look at maybe an alternate? Can we begin to shift slowly in that way? And sometimes that's more appealing than I want you to all of a sudden just be like, I'm amazing. And I look in the mirror every day and I say I'm great and like whatever. Cause then they're like, that's not realistic to me. Like, I don't know what that is. And I don't know that that would work. And I'm scared of that. And then, oh, it's so activating. Like everything that they believe and feel just right if you approach it that way. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I have found to be helpful. And then my encouragement to them is folks who have a lot of those tally marks, there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of self-criticism, but they also have the capacity to be some of the most compassionate people because if those same things shift towards compassion, they have an incredible capacity there. And that makes me feel really hopeful for them. And that tends to be like pretty encouraging, I think, for folks. or at least when I've shared that, people seem to soften to that idea a lot. But yeah, Brene Brown, I'll leave you with her famous quote of owning our story and loving ourselves is through that process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. And I think it really kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff from today. So I don't know
Awesome.
if I answered y'all's questions, but I tried.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I think one question I have for you is as a therapist, when you find that you're disconnected from your compassion for your client, as I'm sure happens to a lot of us from time to time, what are the things that bring you back to that? Do you
Yeah,
have practices or, yeah.
I do. So one thing that helps me with that is if I can contextualize that I might not be alone in this reaction to this client, which makes me feel so much more um, like a deeper sense of empathy for them of like how maybe isolated and truly like they're struggling out with this outside of the room, like relationally, that this could be a barrier for them in a lot of ways to also be getting what they're needing in other places. So sometimes that points me back to, okay, if I'm feeling this way, other type of people might be feeling this way. This person is really kind of going through it. So that's kind of one thing in a way. I always like to check in with myself to make sure that it's like not something that's just coming up in me in that, like, right, like am I just having a reaction to something in my story? I think that's kind of important. And then I was thinking about too, and when I noticed that, my gut, my go-to in the moment is, okay, how can I open up and be more curious right now? Because I think if my compassion's a little off, I might not be asking the same questions I would with someone who I'm really feeling that way towards. And so if I can begin to go there, that tends to help me shift back to that place because as I get to know more, I tend to get to know them better. That tends to help in that process,
Mhm.
personally. But
Yeah, that's awesome. Any other questions you guys have? I think you nailed it.
all
Yeah.
right. Well, thank
Thanks
you.
for sharing with us. Before we close out, where can people get connected to you or find you?
Yeah, you guys can visit my not so social media Instagram page to know that I exist. No, I'm just kidding. At Protea Gray Psychology, and then I repost a lot of Auntie Colbert because she just really inspires me. And then on my website, you can go there. It's just proteagracepsychology.com. And there is all my information, like my phone number, my email, all that. And then for clients, there's a contact form. They can use that directly or reach out via phone or email. So. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. This was lovely. And I feel like an extra layer of warm blanket, calm, and peace going
Oh,
into the
that's
rest
sweet.
of the session. So thank you so much for this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for being here and creating a space for me to come. This is awesome.
All right. Have a good rest of your week.
You too.